Well, welcome everybody. So, as I said, tonight we're going to talk about urban composting, which is a whole nother beast than normal composting or composting on the Royal Farm. This is something I've been working on for the last like decade. When I first started garden farming, I took all these like composting classes, like the New York composting class, composting council, all these different classes, and but all that was based on kind of rural farming, composting in a pile, not having to worry about rats, or if rats come, no big deal. And then yeah, a lot of differences. And what we found is that urban composting is a pretty different one. Like the rats are a big deal, smells are a big deal, and oftentimes you don't have dump trucks of material at once. You got to slowly add, and so we had to kind of over many years come up with our own best practices for composting in the city. So this is what tonight's class is going to be, a presentation of all the things that we kind of found that have worked well in the city. And we're going to talk about a lot of different ways to compost in your backyard, and also talk about if it feels like it's like overwhelming. This is one of the reasons why we set up the DC Parks and Rec Community Composting Network, Cooperative Network. We have 56 compost cooperatives in these rat-proof and smell-proof bins all over the city. Over 2,000 people are composting with us. So if you're looking just for an easy, everything's all set up for you kind of thing, we'll talk a little bit about that. But if you want to try it in your own backyard or at your garden, we're going to also talk about all the different ways that you can try composting and do it responsibly. um yeah, Lori said the neighbors are noisy, so my compost bins are well hidden. Yeah, nosy. Yeah, you definitely want to that's the thing. If you're doing it in your backyard, you want to make sure it's not smelly, it's you're not attracting rodents and stuff, because definitely in the city, people care more about rats than they do about diverting organic waste from the dump. So you got to do it right, and make sure everyone's on board with what you're doing. So but yeah, we're going to talk about different parts of composting, what it is, the sciences, the urban best practices. And then we'll also talk about some really cool alternative ways to compost, like Verma Compost, Bokashi, things like that. Um, but yeah, let's start out with what is compost. So a lot of people think compost is just soil. It's not soil. It's an amendment that you create from organic waste, that you mix in with soil, and you do that. If especially if you're a new gardener, just something to think about. It's like, this is something that you need to incorporate into your garden every year, is compost. It's for a whole bunch of different reasons. So compost, one, it's full of organic matter. That's basically food for your plants. So you want to, if you don't keep on adding organic matter into your soil, you're basically going to run out of food for your plants. So you need to mix in compost, ideally like kind of cover your whole garden with like an inch of compost and then till it in, or whatever practices you have. So at the same time, it also has a lot of great, biology for your garden that's going to make your plants healthier. It's got some really beneficial, bacteria and funguses and things that are going to really help your soil break down different nutrients to make them plant available. And it's also going to just make your plants overall healthier. It's great with water retention. So if you have like really sandy soil, you mix in compost, it will help hold on to that water. And even vice versa, if you have like very clay soil with not much porosity, if you mix in a bunch of compost over the years, it's going to help kind of bust up that clay and make a lot more pores and openings and stuff for that clay structure. So it can also help build structure. It can help with erosion. It can help hold on to soil, so it's not going to wash away so easily. It can help even if you have some toxic stuff in your soil. There's a thing called bioremediation, where if you add enough compost over the years, it will actually break down different toxins and things as well. And this is one of the coolest parts. If you have if your pH is a little bit off, if you keep on adding compost every year, it actually creates what's called a pH buffer zone, where if your pH is just a little bit off, it will create a buffer zone that can actually, where your plants can tolerate, pHs that are maybe like a half a point off or something like that. And this is really great with things like blueberries, you know, because blueberries like more acidic soil. So if you can't, if you're in a place where you can't, you know, acidify your soil, you can just keep on adding compost, and that should help, you know, as well, you know, deal with the off balance pH. So compost is just amazing, and for your garden. At the same time, it's like amazing for the planet as well, because we you know, why we compost is normally we send, you know, our trash, including our organic waste, to the dump. And what the, you know, typically most dumps are is they just bury the waste, they top off the, you know, they you know bury it, but then they create this anaerobic. So you're gonna hear this a lot. Aerobic is an environment full of oxygen. Anaerobic is an environment that doesn't have oxygen. So that's really important for the compost, we'll talk about later. But it creates this anaerobic environment that basically, you know, turns all this organic waste into greenhouse gases like methane and things, and releases it. And it's really bad for the environment. It's really bad for, you know, you know, for a number of different reasons, runoffs, you know, things like that. And at the same time, it's like all that organic waste, that could be plant food, you know. There's a thing called a nutrient cycle, where that's why forests, you don't have to fertilize forests, you know, because they create all this plant, you know, material, and then they, you know, they drop their branches and seeds and leaves and things, and all that breaks down and then refeeds itself. So it, you know, that's ultimately what you want in your garden, is this nutrient cycle where you're not, you know, you're not, you know, throwing away all your organic waste. You're actually, you know, reincorporating it, so you to the point where you don't ever actually have to, I mean, that's the goal, is, and where you get to the point where you don't have to actually buy compost. You know, you can just make your own compost straight from the waste that you're, you know, the plant waste and organic waste that you're creating. So that's why it's super important to compost, you know, not only for the environment, but it's also healthy for your garden. And it's just making your own compost is cheap. You know, I managed a garden that was like over 200 plots. And that was our number one expenditures. We would, you know, buy, you know, we would use most of the plot fees to buy a couple dump trucks full of compost that would come, you know, 2 hours away from only, you know, Virginia. That huge carbon footprint just to dump this, you know, it was just crazy. So we started making our own compost, and eventually we produced enough where we didn't have to buy compost. So we used that money for other awesome things. So a lot of different reasons, but you definitely want to, you know, figure out how you're going to get compost some way if you're going to be gardening, from buying it, producing it, joining the compost cooperatives, you know, something. Yeah, it's a important part of the garden cycle. But the problem is like all of our composting, most of our composting courses and classes and standards and all that stuff are based on what we call industry standards. So they're based on these big compost facilities or these big farms where they, you know, have like 3 dump trucks full of you know, carbon material, and then a dump truck full of food scraps, and they mix it all together, and they water it, and they have, you know, they can take, you know, monitor the temperatures, and they have paid staff to manage it, you know, which is great, but that's not the community level. The community level is going to be a lot different. For example, rats and smells are your biggest concerns. You cannot, you know, you make your neighbors angry because they're smelling your compost bin, you're going to lose your compost bin. Same with rats. You know, if people see rats running around from your compost bin, you know, you may lose your compost bin. As opposed to, you know, industry standards, they're out on some, you know, industrial zoning area where it's okay to have rats, and it's okay to have smells and things. You know, urban composting, oftentimes that you don't have paid staff, so you have to do it as a community level, where you're doing it in your backyard, or you're doing it as with a community garden with volunteers, or you're doing it as a compost cooperative. But it's the idea is not that one paid person does all the work, but then that is more of like a communal level where a bunch of people are working on this as well. So we'll talk a lot about how that's going to work. And one of the biggest differences is like you're not going to have all the material you need to create a big, nice pile of compost at once. You're going to be, you know, you're saving food scraps a little bit at a time, and you're going to be dropping that off in your compost bin a little bit at a time. So we really had to redo all the industry standards to kind of balance that. So we came up with some really cool techniques to where you can actually compost by adding a little bit at a time, which is not what in the industry standards, you have to have all the material at once. But urban composting or community composting, we came up with some different ways where you can, you can do it a little bit at a time. So a lot of different, so a lot of different, standard practices and things around urban composting. And this is mainly what we're going to talk about today, is all these different exceptions from normal composting. But we'll start out actually just talking about the normal science of composting. So there's, there's lots of different categories to compost, I'm sure, but we broke down two different, categories, mainly hot or active compost and cold compost. So hot or active compost, or a lot of people call that bacterial compost, is when you create, you mix in a bunch of ingredients, different organic, like carbons and nitrogens and water and air. You mix it all together, and if you do it right, it actually attracts bacteria that come in, and then the more the bacteria multiplies, they actually produce heat, to the point where if you got a nice pile, you'll actually start seeing steam coming off that pile. And if you get a big enough pile, this is bigger than anything in your backyard, but you get a big enough pile, you can actually catch it on fire, because you'll get enough bacteria producing enough heat. And what that bacteria does is it eats all your organic matter and then poops out this really great, nice, nutrient rich, or food for your plants, called compost. It's really cool. You can get thermometers, and that will help gauge how much bacteria you have, how successful you're doing it. And it's definitely one of the quickest ways. So if you want to make a lot of compost quickly, bacterial composting or pile method is definitely the way to go. But then we have cold composting, which this doesn't involve really any bacteria. This finds different other ways to actually eat up the organic matter and produce, some really nice compost. One of the biggest ones, worms, or what we call Verma Compost. They make hands down the best compost out there. It just takes forever, and we'll talk about how to make a worm bin today. So it's the most amazing compost. It's just they're very slow at making compost. And then BSFL is actually called black soldier fly larva. We'll talk about that as well. That's a really interesting way to make composting. Even like burying, compost into your garden. Like if you're going to have, if you have a grass area and you're planning on doing the garden the next, let's say it's fall and you're planning on doing the garden in the spring, you can actually bury a whole bunch of compost, bury it deep enough, at least like 6 inches. So, like a raccoon's not going to dig it up. And then all the biology in the soil is actually going to break stuff down and make it really nice. It's going to be a really nice garden soil by spring. So you have that, Bokashi is like a fermentation composting that we'll talk about. And then just, straight up carbon piles that's just like, those giant garden waste piles that sit there for years. They're composting just very slowly, So we'll talk about all of this stuff today, but we're going to start out with hot composting or bacterial composting. So basically hot composting, like I said, you have 4 ingredients. If you mix it just right, it will attract this bacteria that will come in, that will gobble up all your great organic matter, or that's not plant available. And then they'll poop out this really great, compost that is plant available. So that's why a lot of this organic matter is just like your tomato plant you can bury a bunch of sticks and leaves into the ground, and that's great for your soil eventually, but that's not plant available. Your tomato can't pull up food from from leaves and sticks, but if you have bacteria that eat that leaves and sticks, and bacteria and fungus, and then they break it down to a point where it actually becomes plant available, and all of a sudden your tomato can start eating that stuff, that organic matter. So that's what you're doing with this hot composting. You're breaking it down to the point that your plants can actually start eating it. So you're making plant food basically. So we have 4 different ingredients. You have green material, or what we call nitrogen, and brown material is what we call carbon. So everything's got nitrogen and carbon into it. Just some things have a lot more nitrogen and some things have a lot more carbon. So that's how we divide it between nitrogen and carbon. And then we have water and oxygen. So those are the 4 ingredients that you, if you mix it just right, you'll attract this really great aerobic bacteria that will eat everything up and make really great compost. But also, if you mix it wrong, like a lot of times, if you overwater or and it gets the oxygen gets pushed out, it becomes an anaerobic environment, and then that attracts a whole different host of bacteria, a completely different type that will come in. They'll eat up your bacteria. You'll eat up your organic matter, but instead of like pooping out like this really great compost, that they'll actually just poop out greenhouse gases. So they're taking all like the nitrogen and all this great stuff that you want back into your garden, and they're just shooting it up into the ozone. So, but what's great thing about composting is it's a very forgiving process. So if you accidentally mess up and you make an anaerobic situation, you can just add some carbon, mix it up, let it dry out, and then the bad bacteria will go away, and and then the good bacteria will come back. So it's definitely something where it's a lot of kind of tweaking as you go kind of thing. But like I said, it's a forgiving process. So if you make a bad batch, you can turn that back into a good batch in a couple days. So let's talk about the ingredients. First one is green material, and this is really the fuel that's going to attract get your compost going, and it's going to attract the bacteria. Because if you just let a giant pile of just like old garden waste sit in the corner of your garden, it's going to be there for a couple years before it breaks down. But if you add some nitrogen heavy things, that's what really the bacteria loves, is nitrogen. If you add that stuff, they're going to come in, gobble up the nitrogen and the carbon, and break it down really quickly. I love the example of the PG County yard waste facility. So they pick up all the yard, the street leaves and stuff, and they take it to this facility, and they make what's called leaf grow, which is like a very real generic, cheap but good compost that you can buy in the bag. You can get in bulk from different places. So it's a basic compost, and just for the leaves, they chop up all the leaves, they water it, and they turn it. But all those leaves, they're carbon heavy. It takes I think it takes around like 10 to 12 months to make a finished product. And they started piloting this program with food scraps. Food scraps like raw vegetables and fruits and stuff have a lot of nitrogen. So they started mixing that into the leaves, which attracted a lot more bacteria, which created higher temperatures. It broke things down quicker, and all of a sudden they're making a finished product in 2 to 3 months. So that's really what we're going for right now. When we're making this compost, is we're trying to why we want to incorporate green material or nitrogen heavy material is so we can speed things up, make a finished product ideally like 3 to 4 months at the community level, and make it a much higher quality. At the same time, you got to be careful with green materials, because that's what's going to attract rats and things like that, like your food scraps. So the basic green materials that we use, so I divided it up between things that could attract rodents and things that don't attract rodents, in case someone wants to. So you can still compost in your backyard. You can do it in an open system that's not rat proof. You just want to avoid anything that rats want to eat. So for the things that they do want to eat, and the main thing that we compost is mainly raw vegetables and fruit scraps. So that's the main thing that we're looking for, is a lot of food scraps and things like that. Also, coffee grounds are really great, tea bags. And we try to stay away from most dairy, because the dairy can get stinky. It can create pathogens if you don't do it right. But crushed eggshells are fantastic. So that's a huge source of calcium for your garden. You can wash them if you want, or you can just throw them in there, and they'll all break down. So that's like the main things that we're composting food wise. And then there's other things that you can compost if you don't want to deal with rats. And that's like your fresh leaves. So a lot of times, like whether something's a nitrogen or carbon is if you get it fresh or not. If like fresh grass or fresh leaves, is full of nitrogen, but if you let it sit for a while, the nitrogen will escape, and then it will leave it more, and then it will be more of a carbon. So you're adding like fresh garden waste, adding flowers, hair, which I thought was kind of weird until I've actually met a bunch of people who compost their dog hair. They have like dogs that shed like crazy, and they just got constantly have tons of hair. And it does take a while to break down. It's a little bit harder to break down than most nitrogen, green material, but it does eventually, and it's very nitrogen heavy. So these are the basic green materials that we're looking for. And then there's certain things that are super high in green in nitrogen that you can use. You want to be very intentional when you use it. You don't want to just like fill up your whole compost bin full of manure. You want to like mix it with carbon or let it sit and age it, things like that. But so if you want to try some high nitrogen things, so these things are really going to get your compost going, get it cooking, get some really great temperatures. Organic manure is fantastic. So when you're using manure, you want to make sure it's 100% organic, because a lot of times they'll spray herbicides on the hay that they feed the horses, and then that will be persistent and will survive the stomach, and then it will survive the composting, and then all of a sudden you're putting herbicides back in your garden. So instead, you want to do organic manure. So the best way to get organic manure is national park stables. There's one in Rock Creek and one in DuPont Forest. So they by law, by policy, they every part of the horse's diet has to be organic. And you can just roll up with it. Sometimes it's good to call ahead of time to find the hours, but usually you can just go up there with your car and just fill up buckets full of manure. So there's two different kinds of manures though. There's fresh manure that's really fantastic for composting. You never want to put fresh manure, like if it's steaming, you don't want to put it in your garden because it's too high in nitrogen. It's got lots of salts. It's going to do what it's called burning your plant. Which makes your plant look really sad, and it just sucks all the water away from the roots. But instead, if you can do two things with manure. You can let it just sit in the pile for a whole year, and then that's called aged manure. And then at that point, once it stops steaming and all that stuff, you can add it straight to your garden as a great source of nitrogen. That's like if you buy manure from like a garden center, that's usually aged manure. So that's definitely safe to put straight into your garden. You definitely want to mix it up with your soil though. You don't want to plant put a plant and grow plants straight from manure. You want to mix it up really well until it in. But then fresh manure, you can also add that to your compost. You don't want to just, like I said, you don't want to fill up your whole compost bin with fresh manure, but you mix it up with a bunch of carbon. We'll talk about the mixing process in the next chapter. Yeah, that's one way to do to get your compost going. Super high nitrogen, it will attract tons of bacteria. It's a great way to just get your compost pile going. And then other examples that won't attract rodents, because rodents can they can be attracted to manure. Is or fresh grass clippings. So if you ever like had someone bag their grass and you smell that bag, it's just like straight ammonia coming off of that. So that's just grass is full of nitrogen. But once you let it like sit there and dry like straw, all the nitrogen leaves and it's very carbon heavy. But if you get it while it's fresh, you can mix that into your compost, and that's a great way to get your compost bin going as well. Like I said, you don't want to, have a giant, you don't want just fill your whole bin full of fresh grass. You want to mix it in the right proportions with carbon, which we'll talk about in a second. And then alfalfa, if you buy that at like, farm stores and stuff like that, some people use that as a great way to kickstart your compost. But that's like your high nitrogen. These are your regular nitrogen. This is what most people use is raw vegetables and fruit scraps and coffee grounds and things. And then if you want to really kickstart your comp, you don't have to, but this is a great way to kind of get your a lot of nitrogen. And then we have what's called brown material or your carbon material. And so this is going to be like your base. This is what's going to keep your nitrogen in check. It's going to keep it from smelling too bad or attracting rodents and things. So it's super important, but at the same time, it's this is one of the hardest parts about composting is finding enough carbon material. A lot of this comes from your garden, because this is a lot of your organic waste that comes out. We usually let it sit and then let it dry out for a couple weeks, and then it's great carbon sources. But that's only going to get you so far, and then you also need to find other sources around the city. Like all of our compost cooperatives are constantly looking for carbon material. And that's the problem. It's like if you don't have enough carbon, you can't compost. You just got to throw away your food scraps until you can find enough carbon. because this is what's going to keep things from smelling too bad. But there's a whole bunch of acceptable carbon material. You got dried plant waste, that's like basically plant waste that you take from your garden and let it dry out for a couple weeks. Dried leaves, leaves are great. Try to shred them if possible. Wood chips are fantastic. Sawdust and wood shavings, as long as it's still, as long as it's not pressure treated, because remember, pressure treated wood has that copper in it, which is a fungicide, which is going to hurt a lot of your biology. So you don't want to do pressure treated and sawdust. Straws important, great. Remember, straws for people, hays for horses, straws for people. So straw is like a farm grain, like barley, where the heads are chopped off, but it's mostly stalks. Well, like hay is just like they chop down a big wild field, and they feed those to horses because it's got tons of seeds and it's high in protein. But if you compost hay, some of it, the seeds are going to fry up if you do a good job and get a hot compost pile. But a lot of those seeds are going to survive, and then you're going to be planting grass seed all over your garden. So make sure it's straw. Newspaper, most newspaper in this country, it uses soy ink, so that's perfectly fine to compost. Avoid the fancy stuff like the shiny. Some of the shiny stuff is clay based. You can compost it. It just doesn't compost very well. But usually in the more expensive and fancier paper, a magazine or paper is, the more you're getting towards more toxic dyes. But just standard newspaper is fantastic. You just got to rip it up in little pieces first, or if you have a paper shredder, even better. Shredded paper is fantastic. Carbon source. Dryer lint, as long as you're not using any toxic dyes or anything like that, or dryer or whatever, as long as it's like organic, natural, dryer sheets. Seashells, which it's some work, but it's really fantastic. It's really amazing for your garden. It's full of all kinds of micronutrients so if you have like a clam bake or something, or if you eat a bunch of if you're eating a bunch of like crustaceans, what you can do is you want to either boil them or bake them. You want to sanitize them a little bit, then put them in the bag and smash them with a hammer and then put it in your compost. And what's going to happen, it's just going to be like the most amazing, fertilizer for your garden if you do that. It's just a lot of work. And if you throw them in while they're still smelling, they may attract some animals. So you want to make sure that you boil, or bake them or something to get them to stop smelling. And then if you have a fire pit in your house, as long as you're not using fire starters or any kind of like chemical starter, you can use that ash. You can mix in the ash, which is really great. Like it has phosphorus and a bunch of other great nutrients as well. Yeah, crab shells, totally any kind of crustaceans. Even if you cook it with seasoning, I think so. I would just make sure, like I said, to boil it. And you can even make like a broth out of it as well if you boil it. Yeah, I would definitely just make sure it's sanitized. Or if you have a fire pit, a lot of people will throw all their shells in the fire pit, and then they have a fire, and then they come back the next day and gather them up, and they won't really smell anymore. You just don't want to make your compost bin smell like a bunch of crabs, because that's going to attract a lot of rodents. But like I said, it's really, really great and nutritious for your soil. Like they sell compost that has seashells and lobster shells and stuff in them, and it's super expensive because it's really good stuff. And carbon, like I said, carbon is one of the harder parts of the equation. Is trying to find enough carbon to mix with your food scraps. And so there are some possible. I actually have a Google Doc with all the tree services and a lot of different places to get carbon. So if you're looking for like a lot of carbon sources like wood chips, like if you're at a garden, you can reach out. I'll share that with you. But there's a bunch of like, especially if you're in a garden and you can use a lot of material at once, tree services, wood chip company, when they're taking down trees, Pepco and different places, they usually have a lot of wood chips. They usually have to drive out of the city to drop the wood chips. So if sometimes they're pretty happy to drop it off in your front yard or at your garden. There's an app, Get Chip Drop. I've heard some people have success with that, but also like DDOT, Department of Transportation, has a wood reuse program that you can submit requests for wood chips, or you can contact private companies. Also, there's urban forestry has like city arborists around the city. They have like they're in different areas, and you can, there's a website. If you type in like DC urban forester or urban arborist, if you can't find it, send me an email and I'll send it to you. But there, you should have an arborist that's assigned to your area, and then you can reach out to them and see if there's any tree work happening, and they can usually drop some chips off for you. Also, there's different mills around the city that do non-pressure treated wood. You can get the sawdust from there. Paper shredding companies, some of them, most of them, they have to burn their stuff by policy, but some of them will give you the shredded paper. Or if you work at a school or office building, with a shredder, just grab that paper, every time it fills up, because that's fantastic composting material. And then, if you have local landscapers, they can give you waste. A lot of times I'll walk around my neighborhood and they'll see these paper bags full of garden waste. And that, if I'm low on carbon, I'll grab a bunch of those, because a lot of times they're supposed to be composted, but sometimes they don't get composted. Sometimes they get sent straight to the dump. So definitely encourage, grabbing people's, organic waste. Just peek in there, make sure it's not full of poison ivy or thorns first, but for sure. And then if you are getting a load of wood chips, I put this as a kind of show you how much. Most of the trucks are like 5 cubic yards. There's a few 10 cubic yard dump trucks, and you never know how much wood chips you're going to get, because you don't know like how big their job is. But just be careful. I mean, if you order a load of wood chips and you're expecting a small pile, I mean, at least, you can ask them how big their truck is. And then if it's 5 cubic yards, at least, yeah, I mean, at least if you don't think you can handle the all 5 yards, I probably wouldn't order it, because you're going to be responsible for doing something with those wood chips. So just a heads up. And then when you get a lot of this, so a really important part about your carbon and nitrogen is, especially carbon, is the best way, the best thing you can do with a lot of this stuff once you get it is try to chop it up as much as possible. And so even if your food scraps, chop it up, before you compost it. If you got leaves, run it over a lawnmower. Wood chippers. We have a wood chipper in our tool share. It keeps on breaking. It's currently broken, but sometimes when it's fixed, you can borrow them. Even just getting some loppers and cutting up some garden. The more you chop things up, the more surface area there is for bacteria to come in and eat. So the more room there is for more bacteria to come in. So the more room, so the idea, if you chop it up in smaller pieces, you're going to have more bacteria. It's going to be hotter. It's going to compost quicker. So definitely, take the time to chop things up. And then there are things to materials to avoid. I broke it into always avoid versus sometimes, use moderately. So always avoid like plants with like diseases and pests, and so if there's like we pulled out, we were composting collards today from that overwintered, and there was one that was just covered in aphids. So I just threw that in the dumpster. I'm not going to, throw that in my compost pile and then have to fight, aphids for a while. So, definitely if you have like, especially tomatoes that if you have tomatoes that die in like in the middle of the summer, don't compost those, because they probably have some kind of disease. Or if you have plants, it's impossible to avoid all seeds. You'll have some seeds, like tomato seeds and squash and stuff, and you'll even get like volunteers, like avocados. Like if you're eating a lot of avocados and you compost the pits, the compost process is like a perfect germination for avocados. You'll have little avocado trees, sprouting. So you'll have some of that stuff, but that's okay. But you don't want to throw like a plant that's gone to seed that's got thousands of seeds on top of it. You don't want to throw that in the compost bin, because then you're just going to be spreading those seeds around. And then we do what we call a pathogen and prevention approach, where instead of like industrial composting, they'll take meat and dairy and pet waste and all that stuff, but they'll monitor it, make sure they have proper temperatures, because if you get the compost pile hot enough, it will actually kill all kinds of pathogens, and so you can compost anything. But you're not going to be able to get your compost pile in your backyard that hot enough, even at a compost cooperative. So we just avoid meats and dairies, any kind of animal waste outside of eggshells. We avoid any animal products, because one, that can you can breed pathogens with that stuff if you're not doing it right, and two, it may smell which could attract things. So it's just easier not to deal with that stuff, especially like pet waste and things like that. And then poison ivy, pesticides, herbicides, anything that's non, toxic, non-biodegradable, all that stuff, avoid. The animal amendments, like, bone meal and fish fertilizer and stuff. If you have some old stuff, I would just use it, still put it straight in your garden. The problem is that you put a bunch of the fish fertilizer in your compost, your compost bin is going to smell like fish and attract, rodents. And then there's certain things you can use moderately that that you don't want to use too much, but like oils, like if you put too much oil in there, it's actually going to get stinky. But if you got some leftover stir fry, or something, that's fine. You just don't want to throw like a whole stir fry thing in there. And breads and grains and rice, you can compost all that stuff. You just don't want too much of it because it'll get moldy and smelly. So you want to be able to mix it really well if you're doing that stuff. And pine needles and citrus, all fine at moderation. But if you fill up, your compost bin with like, grapefruit, crate of grapefruit or something, it's actually going to make your compost really acidic. So it may not, go well in your garden. So you don't want to, like if you, you can compost, citrus and pine needles, just keep it moderate, don't, do too much. And then if you're a brewer, spent grains. So how people brew stuff is they like boil hops and barley, and then they get all the aromas and all that, the flavors from it, and then they throw away the barley and the hops, and that's called spent grains. And even though it looks brown, it's actually very high in nitrogen. And you can, if you have a home brewer that wants to, compost a little bit of spent grains, that's fine. But local breweries sometimes will reach out to you if you have a compost cooperative, and they love dropping this stuff off, and it just gets so smelly that you don't want to deal with a lot of it. And then these compost bags are fantastic, but they're made from corn plastic, so they're completely biodegradable. The problem is they take a while for it to break down. So then you have all this nice compost, but then you have these little anaerobic pockets of nasty, compost. So what I would do, you can still use these, but I would open the bag up, drop the contents, and then rip the bag in little pieces, in a couple pieces, and then drop it into the compost bin, just to keep it aerobic. And then definitely, you definitely want to avoid tomato diseases and especially tomatoes, because a lot of the wilts and the blights will survive. If your compost isn't hot enough, they'll survive the compost bin and process, and then you're spreading it around your garden again. Definitely things with diseases. Some people will compost like early blight, like the yellow leaves on the bottom of your tomato plant, that everyone has. Some people will compost those, and as long as you're getting some temperature, or that's everywhere as well. But since other people don't, they throw the entire tomato plant in the trash and then compost everything else. So it's really up to you. I just avoid anything that looks diseased. I won't throw in the compost bin. Blights and wilts. But if you want to compost, like if you want to be 100% zero waste and you want to compost this stuff, one, you got to, get a compost thermometer, try to, you practice composting for a while. And when we got it down where you can actually get a pile really hot, you want to get it at least 135 degrees for several days. And then, and that should kill anything in there, pathogens or viruses or stuff. Or you can solarize it. You can put it in a black trash bag, put it in the sun for like a week or two. And then whatever's in there, it's pretty, it is baked, and then you could throw it in your compost bin. It'll be pretty smelly though. All right, so we have our nitrogen and our carbon. So the third ingredient is oxygen. So oxygen, like I said, we want aerobic bacteria. We don't want anaerobic bacteria unless you're doing Bokashi. So you want to get it, you want as much oxygen as possible going into this product. That's why people have these tumblers, and then once they fill it up, they'll crank it, and it mixes it up and allows more oxygen to get in. And that's why people will turn their compost piles and flip them over or turn them. It's just they want more oxygen to go in and allow more aerobic bacteria. But then the problem, Yeah, well, and then there's actually, if you want to get really fancy, there's ways to actually actively and passively aerate your compost bins. This is really cool. You can actually get an air blower, and then have pipes that go and but you fill your compost bins on top of these pipes with holes in them, and it'll actually blow air into your pile. You can put it on a timer, and it's called an O2 system, and you can make a finished compost in like a month, and you don't have to it's very low labor. You don't have to turn it. It just takes a little while to set up. So if you're interested in that, check out like Peter Moon's O2 Systems. He's a guy from Oregon that designs different models like this. And then you can also do passive aeration, where you can get like pipes with holes in them, put them on the bottom, build your pile on top, and then as the pile heats up, it will actually pool air, convection. The hot air actually pulls other air into it, and you can actually passively aerate your pile. And this is why we designed our a bin we call Compost Knox, and we have on the floor is actually made out of paver stone, so it doesn't rot the floor, but we space them out with screws, so there's actually cracks, and that allows, as the pile heats up, it actually, sucks up more air and then aerates itself. So you can get all kinds of different clever ways to do this, or you can just once a month, grab a pitchfork and turn your pile. That's another way to do it. And then the last ingredient is water. So this is so that bacteria that you want actually needs water, but the problem is it also needs oxygen. So if you get too much water in there, it pushes out the oxygen, and they'll leave, and you get bad anaerobic bacteria. So you're looking for you want your compost to be moist. You don't want it to be dry, but you don't want it to be soaking. It wants to be nice and moist, to the point where they say if you can squeeze compost and then you can see your fingerprints. I don't know who actually does that, but that's what I've taken all these classes where they're like, squeeze your compost, and that will show you. Really, the best thing to do with water is build a bin, get it off the ground with some legs, and then give it drainage. And then you can never overwater, because compost will hold on to the water at once, and then it will let go of any extra water. But unfortunately, if it's on the ground like a pile, and you're watering it really heavy, then there's nowhere for the water to go, and that's where you get like a really stinky pile. So yeah, if you don't want to worry about overwatering, just get it. Build some kind of bin off the ground, and I'll show you different models that you can do, and then and give it drainage, and then that's fine. But if you are watering, you want to just be, ideally not so much like this, but watering cans, you want to lightly water, and you want to kind of take your time and kind of spend first couple weeks kind of learning about how much too much water versus if you water it too much, it'll start getting stinky. So then you want to water it just amount. So it may take a couple weeks to kind of dial in how much water you should be watering every week. But yeah, so that's the 4 ingredients. You got carbon, nitrogen, water, and oxygen. So now we're going to talk about different kinds of urban composting best practices to actually do it and to make this pile in an environment that's not going to attract tons of rats or piss off your neighbors. So here's a couple examples of some hot composting bins. So none of these are rat proof though. So if you're just doing grass and as your nitrogen source, that these are totally fine. But if you're using food scraps, I probably wouldn't do these, because you're going to get some rodents. So a lot of people will just make like a pallet bed, and then just make your pile inside the pallet. I've seen these with these garbage cans where they'll drill holes around them, and then they'll fill up the can, and then they'll even knock the can over and roll it on their yard to kind of turn it and mix it up and aerate it. Having the cattle fence, where you just fill up the cattle fence with all kinds of material, and then when it's full, you gotta kind of cut the some roots and stuff on the bottom, but you can actually pick up the cattle fence and then make it and move it over, and then start a new pile, and you just keep on making different piles. This is one that starts off rat proof. I've seen a lot of farms use this, where they just make a barrier with straw, and then bales, and then top it off with straw bales, and that works fine until the straw starts breaking down, and then all of a sudden you have rats everywhere. So that one of our farms tried this out, and it was great for the first 6 months. They're like, look, it's rat proof, and then the straw started breaking down a little bit, and then they had a horrible rat infestation. So I definitely recommend, you want to have a system that's at least 3 feet cube. If you're going to get decent temperatures, you need to have a pile that's at least 3 feet tall. Needs, as much circulation as possible. That's why these pallets are good. Drainage if possible. And then what's nice is having 2 bins. So if I just have 1 bin, I'm just going to fill this up, and then I got to wait for it to break down over a couple months, pull that out, and then I can start filling up again. But if you have 2 bins, you can fill one up. Once it's full, you can start filling the other one up while the second one's breaking down. So, but oh yeah, like I said, all these are fine. You just don't want to use food scraps. So that's why we actually designed, because you can't really buy a rat-proof compost bin. Well, there's a couple of models that we'll show you, some small ones. But that's why we actually worked with this organization. It's not around anymore, called Urban Farm Plans, and we designed this new bin based on all the horrible experiences that we were years of trying out bins and having rat situations. And this is one. It's 100% rat proof. It will over time. It will, it's kind of heavy, so it may sink a little bit, or the wood may warp. So you might have to tweak it to keep it rat proof. And that's what we're experiencing. Is I'll have to every couple of years I have to go out to a bin and make some adjustments just to make sure it stays rat proof. But it starts out really rat proof. And then we even add some retrofits to make it mouse proof as well. But this is called the Compost Knox, and you can hire people to design it. I can share the plans with you if you want to build it. It was like $1,000 in materials for a 3-bin, or like $200-300 for a 1 bin. That was pre-pandemic, so you probably add a couple hundred on that. You can also hire contractors to build them as well for several $1,000s if you want. Or if you don't, you can join a compost cooperative, and these are all the compost cooperatives have a 3-bin system. Or you can make you can use the designs that we have on this, which I'll go over in a second, and you can use it to make a generic bin out of like pallets. But let's talk about why this system works really well in the urban environment. And that one is rats. So there's actually 2 different types of rats. There's some that like to tunnel. There's some that like to climb. There's some that can actually dislocate their shoulder blades and squeeze through really small areas. It's crazy. So that's what you're. So you need to design something that where they can't tunnel from underneath. They can't squeeze through a crack, and they can't climb up and over. So you're actually creating like a in vessel system. And that's what we did with, there's a couple different retrofits we can use. And like I said, we used to do a carpentry class. I'm going to hopefully bring it back soon, where we'll actually use these designs, and we'll make a pallet compost bin for way less expensive than this stuff. But a couple things to think about is, one is hardware cloth. Don't use chicken wire. Rats can run right through chicken wire. Hardware cloth is really what's going to keep the rats out. And 1/2 inch for rats. But if you want to keep the mice out, you got to use the 1/4 inch. But at the same time, you're stapling this onto the bin, so they can actually they can definitely pull out staples and then squeeze through the edges. So that's why you want what's called Fascia Boards, which is more of a design thing, but we use it so we on the edges of the harbor cloth, we'll actually screw in another board, like a 2x4 or something like that. And that way the rats can't peel open the sides of the edge of the harbor cloth and then squeeze in. And then you want a solid floor. You don't want something that they can tunnel in through. So that's what we actually, I really like to, we use concrete blocks, because a compost bin, if you use a wood floor, it'll be great for like 5 years, and then it will start rotting the floor. But the concrete blocks will last for a really long time. But you don't have to use concrete blocks. Like I said, if you just want to make a generic bin out of pallets, you can use a pallet. Just make a box out of pallets, and the floor can be a pallet. Just put hardware cloth over everything, and that works just as well as what fine as. And then you want to have some kind of lid so on top of it, so they can't climb up and over. So it takes a little bit of effort to make a rat-proof compost bin. And then there's like certain things that what I love about this bin is it's also smell proof. Some of that is like how we load it, and there's still a compost smell to it, but it's not like a ammonia or a sulfur. It's not something that's going to be horrendous. It's more of this like organic waste kind of a composting. smell. With like I said, the best thing to do with smells is to get the bin off the ground, put some legs on it, and then give it drainage. So that's why, like a pallet, you know, if you use a pallet floor with some harbor cloth on it to make it rat proof, that works really well. These stones work great because we put some screws in between each stone, so it actually there's drainage cracks. The only time these bins ever smell is when the drainage cracks actually clog, and then you got to take a stick and scrape out the drainage cracks. But as long as there's drainage is working, it's never going to get too wet, and that's really what makes the pile smell is overwatering. And then, you know, having like lots of circulation on the sides, having open, you know, as much open as possible so wind can get in there, having a lid so you can control how much. So if it's raining, if you get a really bad rain, it's going to overwater your pile and it's going to get smelly. So having a waterproof lid that kind of keeps the rain off works really well as well. And then one of the key parts about compost bins are these slats, which seems a little weird. It's like, why not just have a little door? But if you have a giant pile in this bin, you have a door and you open up that door, that pile is just going to fall out and you're not going to be able to close the door. The slats, what's nice about the slats is you can adjust, you know, how high or low it is by putting different slats in. So if you're starting a pile off, you can keep it, you know, 1 or 2 slats. And as you're building up that pile, you can keep on adding slats. Which yeah, it's just we'll get a chance to do some composting on one of our Saturday work days, and you'll really see how like slats, like you definitely want to have slats on your compost bin. It makes the bin, you know, it makes it so much easier to process. So that, like I said, that's the compost knock system. I could share the design with you, but it is kind of pricey. You know, it's not bad if you're in a community garden that wants to, you know, everyone wants to throw in, but like this might be a little too pricey for your backyard. Like I said, you can also build a single bin as well for 1/3 of the cost. But you can also take the techniques that, you know, and make a pallet bin or make something much cheaper just by using the different designs on this as well. Or you can join a compost cooperative and just, you know, and we have one of these bins already made for you, and then you don't have to worry about building the system. And then here's some other rat-proof options as well if you don't want to deal with that compost knocks. So tumblers, most tumblers are rat-proof, but tumblers are hard to. The problem with tumblers is like one, I mean, I always have to drill extra holes because it can get kind of nasty and anaerobic. And then 2, once you fill this thing up, it's really hard. The idea is like you're supposed to fill it up and then you're supposed to spin it, and then that spinning, you know, tumbles it and aerates it. But it's really hard to spin these things when they're full, and a lot of times the whole thing will fall over. But most of the times these tumblers aren't big enough to actually have a nice sized pile. The one tumbler I found that works pretty well is this Lifetime 80-gallon one. So if you are going to do a tumbler, I would, you know, I would get this system or something as big as possible. And then even I would probably get 2. So once one fills up, you can start filling up the other one as the first one starts breaking down. These arrow bins, I never used one of these, but I've heard really great things. You put them food scraps in the top, and then it kind of and mixes. There's always mixers and stuff, and then in a couple months later, you get some nice compost in the bottom. And I've heard they're pretty rat proof. So if you want to try those out, I just never actually tried one. Getting like a metal compost bin and drilling a bunch of small holes in them, like 1/4 inch or smaller holes, and then you fill this bin up, maybe get some zipped bungee cords or something to secure the lid, and then you put it on the side and kind of roll it back and forth, and that mixes things up as well. Yeah, it can definitely get a little messy, the metal trash can holes, but some people like them. And then also what I really recommend, this is actually my compost bin at home. So I mean, so it's definitely like you got to decide if you're going to do a home composting bin. Are you doing this to make a lot of compost for your garden? If so, you know, definitely recommend like, you know, the Fort Knox bin or something that's going to process compost really quickly. So I make my compost at a compost cooperative, but then I also have a system at home where I just want to get rid of my organic waste. I harvest this like once a year. You know, I'm not looking to make a lot. I just, you know, it's right outside my kitchen. I just put my food scraps in. So if you want to do something like that, this is a nice system. So I made it out of pallets. So it's a pallet cube. There's a pallet on the floor. I stapled harbor cloth over everything. I made this 2x4 lid. It's not even on hinges. And what I do with this is this is called like a non-turn brown bin. So what I filled this bin completely up with carbon material. And then every time I have food scraps, I just kind of shove the food scraps right in the middle. And then over time, it all breaks down, eventually. But like I said, I only harvest the thing like maybe once a year. It's just more of a way to get to, so I don't have to throw away my food scraps to the dump. So that's another option as well. If you don't want to do a lot of work, just fill this up with leaves and then wood chips, and then just kind of shove your food scraps into the middle when every time you have food scraps, and then it will all slowly break down. But even on these systems, you still need to have carbon material. So it's nice to have like a trash can or something full of leaves that you can mix with your food scraps as well. And we'll talk about the mixing process in a second. So that's some more options if you want to have a home composting system. This is someone sent me this photo. They bought a tumbler, but they were still having rats get into it. So they actually covered the whole tumbler with hardware cloth, and that seemed to work fine. Most tumblers though are pretty rat proof. I think they just had some really persistent rats, but anyway. And then a couple additional parts when you're doing like rat prevention. Is definitely you want to have a clean compost area. You don't want to have giant piles of waste and stuff, all in trash around your compost bin, because the more hiding spots, the more the rats like it. They don't like to be out exposed or in the open. These are carbon bins. We'll talk about carbon bins in a second, but like carbon, like you don't want to, like, you show up with your food scraps, you don't want to run around looking for carbon. You want to have a bin full of like dried plant waste and leaves and shredded paper, and then you can grab that and mix it with your food scraps. Rats don't hang out in there unless it's like wintertime. They might jump in there, so I'll make it make it a little bit, I'll put a top of I make these. I'll show you our carbon bins. We make them out of hardware cloth, and they're pretty. They're not rat proof, but they're enough where rats don't want to hang out in them. Having definitely keeping the eye out for rat holes. We talked about a lot already last class about rats, so I won't go over too much. But definitely making sure your bin isn't that smelly, and which we'll talk about different techniques and. Mainly just keeping the area tidy, keeping your bin in good shape, and then just monitoring the area for any kind of rat holes is like the best thing you can do. And then when you see rat holes, deal with it. Either dry ice it yourself, or call an exterminator if you don't want to deal with it. But I've been having a lot of success with dry ice. You just pick it up a Harris teeter, shove a block, a chunk into in every hole you find, and put newspaper behind it, and then that just carbon monoxides the whole area and it fixates them. We went over all this last class, so I won't go over it too much, but mainly just like rat holes. If you see a hole, you can tell if it's a rat if it's 2 to 4 inches. If it's super small, it might be a mole. If it's super big, it might be a groundhog. Yeah, 2 to 4 inches is definitely a rat. You should definitely respond to that. And you can do that with have-a-heart cages if you want to try to protect them. There's different poisons from organic ones that supposedly, dogs and cats can eat, so you don't have to worry about that, to like really, nasty ones that you want to shove down the hole as far as you can, so dogs and cats don't get to it. Or you can have, these like containers with poison blocks where only rats can fit in. Dry ice works really well. If you got some neighbors with some rat terriers and stuff, these are like dogs that have been bred for 100 years to do some to hunt rats. They're actually pretty effective. And then call an exterminator. So we talked about this as well last class, but if New York Health Department has a rat academies to kind of they have ones specifically for gardens, community gardens. So if you want to learn techniques on how to make your garden and your compost bin not attract rats, it's definitely a great program. But anyway, so now we're going to talk about the 3-bin system, and then we're going to talk about the process of that. So the 3-bin system is really a fantastic system. So Because what's nice about this is you never have to stop loading, you dropping food scraps off. Like when you just have a 1 bin system, like I said, you can fill it up and then you got to wait a couple months for it to break down. This system, what's great about it is only fresh material goes into your first bin. So that so you mix in your food scraps with your yard waste into the first bin, and then once it's full, after about a month or so, ideally, or a couple months, you turn it or you flip it all, take a shovel and scoop it all over to the bin 2, and you let that just sit there for like a month, and then you start filling this bin up with bin 1 again. And then once that's full, you move bin 2 to bin 3, bin 1 to bin 2, and then you fill it back up again. And these bins are just for cooking, what they call curing or curing the compost, because it has to go through all these different processes of different bacterias and stuff. And if you keep on adding fresh material, it's kind of like hitting the reset button. So you want to have a 3-foot pile, but then you want to let it sit and do its thing. So you can add water to it and things, but yeah, you basically want it sit. And the idea is by the time you're after 3 months, after you fill this bin up, bin 3 should be all basically ready to compost. I mean, there'll still be like chunky stuff like avocado pits and wood chips that have lignin in it. It takes longer to break down, but you can sift that and then you got good compost. So the idea is it never, it's just like a 3-bin system. It never stops. You never get to the point where you have to stop dropping off food scraps. So this we'll get some practice on this on one of our field days. We'll process the compost bin. But then how to actually build the compost bin, and I say over time. So like I said, in the industry, like if you're doing like a commercial composter, they're going to bring in like 3 dump trucks of carbon material, 1 dump truck of food scraps. They're going to mix it all on site, water it, and then let it just process and cook for they'll turn it occasionally. That's great if you have all that material at once, but most people they're only you're basically composting your food scraps from your dinner every night, so it's going to take a while to start building that pile up. So that's why we developed a couple techniques that actually allow you to actually build a pile without having to have everything at once. So the first part is you want to make sure you have plenty of carbon. You don't want to start composting food scraps until you have a nice, stockpile of carbon material. And that's why we showed that we do these carbon bins, which can be, hardware cloth bins that we make. It could be a trash can. It could be all different kinds of things. It's nice to have it sealed so you don't have, critters making a home. But there's no food scraps. So it's not like things are trying to get in. They're just looking for a nice, comfortable place, giving it some kind of barrier, obstacle usually, prevents them from doing it. But the idea is you want to have, a bin where you can just drop off, ideally you want your carbon to be a mixture of things, from like wood chips to shredded paper. You don't really want a whole bin full of shredded paper, but if you mix shredded paper with wood chips and garden waste, you want to have like a nice chunky variety of things, and that's what's really going to give you a lot of porosity and it's going to cook really well. And then I'll even like when we're done sifting our compost and we have like the avocado pits and stuff that's been through a compost bin, I'll even throw that in the carbon bin, and that's going to pre-inoculate your material that is going to start all the good biology going. So it's pretty awesome to kind of kickstart it with some old stuff. And at that point, like a rat's not going to want an avocado pit that's been in the compost bin for 3 months. At that point, they don't really want that. So it's safe to kind of throw in your carbon bin and kind of pre-inoculate stuff. But anyway, first step is to get the carbon bin, want a bin full of carbon material first before you start composting. Because if you show up and there's no carbon, you can't add it to the system. You gotta throw it away, because if you just throw a bunch of food scraps on top of your pile, you're gonna have all kinds of critters. So then whatever system you have, you're gonna want to start off by making what we call a carbon biofilter. So ideally, we want to completely enclose any kind of food scraps in carbon. And that way, even if you have something that's kind of smelly in there, it's going to be filtered out, through the carbon area. So that's like a lot of this stuff. you're going to take, we're going to go over all these stuff, and it's not going to click just yet with you until you start composting. But the main thing to really understand with composting is you just can't have any food scraps exposed. No one should walk by your compost bin and see food scraps, because that's, you're going to have fruit flies and all kinds of stuff the first day, and then 2 to 3 days later, you're going to have critters, and even if they can't get in the bin, they're going to hang around in your garden. So that's why we create this like this biofilter, this carbon biofilter. And you start off with just making a nest. So you get a bunch of carbon material and just make a nest with a little trim, and that's going to get you going with like 2 to 3 inches of carbon material. And then you're ready to start dropping the food scraps off. And we do what's called a lasagna composting method. So that's where you alternate different layers from brown material, and then you add some nitrogen, and then brown and nitrogen. And what that does is that kind of slows the composting process. So it buys you some more time to build up your pile and get a nice sized pile going. Because a lot of times if you're going to mix all your material up at once, it's going to break down quicker than it's going to accumulate. But if you do this lasagna method where you just have different layers of carbon and nitrogen, that's going to allow you to build a pile up. It's going to slow down the composting. It's going to build up the pile, and then once you have at least 3 feet, and then you can mix it all together, and then your compost is just going to blow up, and you're going to have great temperatures and stuff. But you definitely recommend using the lasagna at first, just to kind of help build up your pile. And we usually tell people to start off with a 2-to-1 ratio. So if you throw a bucket of food scraps in, you want to fill that bucket up with twice with carbon material to cover on the top. So you want to have the carbon layer should be twice as big as the food layer. And then sometimes people will go down to 1-to-1 if they're not getting the great temperatures and they need more nitrogen, but definitely recommend starting off at a 2-to-1. After a while, you'll just eyeball it. You won't measure it, but try to use a bucket to kind of measure your ratios out at first. So we have that nest. So then we drop off the bucket of food scraps. You spread it out. You don't want any layer to be more than like 2 to 3 inches thick. Or else you're going to have these, it's just not going to compost very well. So you want to have thin layers. So you spread that out. And then if that's 1 bucket of food scraps, I'm going to fill that bucket twice with carbon material and completely cover up any kind of food scraps. So again, like the most important thing to take away from this class is never have any food scraps exposed. So someone's asking how does coffee grinds fit into composting? Yeah, coffee is a little confusing because it's brown, but it's definitely a nitrogen. It's very high in nitrogen. So this is, you definitely, coffee grounds goes with food scraps. So you definitely want to mix in the food scraps and then put 2 buckets of carbon over on top of it. So then, like I said, the most important part, you should never see food scraps, or that's going to attract flies and pests and rodents. Everything should completely be filled up. So you see, the idea is over time, like every day, someone's coming and dropping off another bucket of food scraps and then covering it up with carbon material. And you keep on doing that lasagna, building higher and higher and higher until you fill up your bin, or at least get 3 feet tall. And at that point, you can start mixing your compost. And that's really what the bacteria loves, is when you mix it up really well, the carbon and nitrogen. That's when you're going to see your temperatures just shoot up to like 150, 160 degrees the first couple of days. You're going to have tons of bacteria come in and just start eating things as well, because they'll come a little bit. Things will compost a little bit with lasagna, but it's really not until you mix it all up and add some more water. That's when things get really fancy. When you really start composting really well. So definitely, if your bin one's full, so you take a pitchfork or a shovel and you flip it all over to the second bin. You can add a little bit of carbon if there's exposed food scraps anywhere, but really you don't want to add too much to this pile. You just want to let it cook for a while, and then definitely water it really well. Water at least once a week if possible. And then and if you want to get really crazy, this is what there's a forum called Eco City Farms. They actually they'll pull stuff out once a week. They'll pull all their material out into this, and they built a trough, which is like 2x4s with like a plywood bottom, and then they'll mix it all up, water it, and then put it back into the bin. And they'll do that once a week. It's a lot of labor, but they have amazing compost that's like done in like half the time. But really, I mean, what we do with this, with flipping, we just flip them once, like ideally like once a month. You flip it over, and then that the timing, yeah, you want this to be a 3 to 4 month process with these 3 bins. It's all right if it takes longer. It's just going to be a little slower, and that's fine. Like, you know, turning it at least once a month is plenty. You don't need to like you know, mix it up, you know, once a week. But if you want really great compost, you can try it out. And then a water. So I won't usually water the first bin because I wanted to, I'm trying to slow down the compost process with Lasagna method. So I don't want, but once I flip it over to the second bin, I'll try to water it like at least once a week, if possible. And that's just like a watering can, you know, maybe 5 gallons, 10 gallons. You can water it for 30 seconds with a hose. You just want, you know, easy watering. You don't want high pressure. You don't want to water it too much. And that's, and so, like I said, you can have an open bin, you just let it rain as well. But, and then, so the compost process, so like I said, it will cook a little bit in the first bin with the lasagna method, but once you mix it up, that's when things really, you know, get crazy. And that's when you attract a lot of compost bacteria. And what happens is there's 2 sets of bacteria that come in. So the first set is this mesophilic, and they'll come in and they'll bring your compost temperatures up to 100, 110 degrees. But then it gets too hot for them, and then this new batch of composting or bacteria comes in, the thermophilic, and they'll take it over. And if you do it right, you know, if you add enough water, have good ratios, if you mix it really well, it'll go all the way up to like 150, 160 degrees. Like, you'll get steam off of it, and that's when you have really fantastic compost. You have tons of bacteria. It's breaking down, and, you know, weed seeds, pathogens, all kinds of stuff. That's ideally what you're shooting for. But all that bacteria hangs out in the middle of the bin for some reason, or pile. They don't hang out on the outside. So that's why, like, the compost thermometers are super long. You got to get into the middle of the pile. So they'll hang out in the middle, and they'll eat up, and they'll, you know, you'll have great temperatures, but then they'll start eating up all the nitrogen in the middle. And then once the nitrogen's gone, they'll leave. So that's why you'll see all, you know, the temperatures will spike up super high, 140, 50, and then they'll start dropping down after, like, you know, a week or so, or after a couple of days sometimes. And that's usually a great sign that it's time to turn it again. So once the temperatures drop down to, like, you know, room temperature, you can turn it again. You mix up that compost, and all the nitrogen from the outside is going to get mixed up into the inside, and you're going to have a lot of bacteria come back. They're going to go through this whole process again, and then they'll leave once they eat up all the bacteria. So it's kind of like a roller coaster with every time you turn it, you're kind of restarting the bacterial process. And ideally, you know, if you turn your compost once a month for like 3 months, by the 3rd month, most of that bacteria is going to be gone, or that nitrogen is going to be gone. You'll still have tons of like bugs, like those little roly-polies will be, you know, eating the last bit of nitrogen and organic matter. And then ideally, after about 3 months, you could sift the chunky stuff out. You just kind of let it sit. For a week or 2, I let all the bugs leave, and then it's good. You know, at that point, it's like room temperature, and you can put it back into and you can start putting it into your garden. So when I say for sifting, this is so like I said, there are certain things like corn cobs and avocado pits, hair, wood that needs lignin, it needs funguses to break down. And this is in compost bins. Compost is usually more bacterial, so it takes a while to break down that stuff. So all that stuff, you're going to have to run through your system a couple times. So that's why you want to build a sifter. Usually like 2x4s with some hardware cloth, or you know, there's all different kinds of sifters, and that's where you just want to scoop out your finished compost, put it on the sifter, kind of like, you know, spread it out. All the good stuff will fall to the wheelbarrow. The bad stuff, I just throw back into my carbon bin to like pre-inoculate that stuff. And then once I do that, like I said, then it's time to cure. And the curing stage is basically the bacteria is gone. But there's like if you don't like roly-polies, this is a bad stage for you. There's just thousands of roly-polies on your compost, and they're just eating the last bit of organic matter and then pooping that stuff out into compost. And then once they leave after a week or two, that compost is ready to go in the garden. And then if you want to save some time, definitely recommend building these Tumbler Sifters as well. They work really well. We actually did a whole class on building Tumbler Sifters, and then that's on the Doug Network. You can look up design and build a Tumbler Sifter. It just saves your time, because that's sifting a bin can take hours and hours. But if you have one of these systems, yeah, it's like 20 minutes. So this, I'll play a quick video of how it actually works. Man, this is awesome. So the good stuff is falling out of the sifter into the wheelbarrow, and all the chunky stuff is going back into the trash bin, and that's what we're going to move, put back into the bin. Drop it right to the bottom. Yeah, I mean, I would say you can just try and get it like closer to that. I definitely recommend, if you got a big system, like a 3-bin system, build one of these. It's going to save you so much time. And then storing compost at home. So you can either every day bring your food scraps to the compost bin, or you can store some compost in different ways. And these are the typical ways. These are charcoal filter containers. So so it allows oxygen to get in, so it doesn't get anaerobic and smelly. It'll still get a little smelly, but then usually these will buy you about a week. So you can fill these up with food scraps. After about a week, they'll still start getting smelly. The carbon filters will filter out any kind of bad smells. But yeah, I would have a schedule where once a week you drop these things off. Unless, or if you want to but if you want to store things for a while, like once a month, you need some freezer room. And then you just have a container in a freezer, fill that up with food scraps. And then when you're ready to drop it off, you can drop it off as a solid block of, frozen food scraps, and then just put carbon on top, and it'll melt, and it'll be a lasagna layer. And then Bokashi, we'll talk about Bokashi in a second, but that's a way to kind of store stuff in your home for a while as well. And then composting, like in industrial composting is all about measurements and calculations. Community composting is just kind of more of a sensory approach. If you smell like rotten eggs or manure or ammonia, it's too wet, so you want to throw some carbon in there and mix it up, and then the bad bacteria will go away and the good one will come back. If you have like flies and stuff, you want to walk around the bin looking for any exposed food scraps and cover that up, and then the flies will go away. Or if it's just taking forever to break down, then you probably need more nitrogen or more water, so you can start watering it more, or just go down to a 1-to-1 ratio, carbon to nitrogen, and that should help it as well. And then equipment. So this is like a compost thermometer. I mean, they could be pretty long thermometers. You want to at least have them like 2 feet long, so they can get in the middle of a 3-foot pile. I definitely recommend getting a pitchfork or a manure fork. They work so much better than shoveling with a shovel. A shovel, it's hard work shoveling compost with a shovel. You can get these like probes where you like stab the compost, and then these little wings come out, and it's a way to kind of mix up the compost. They work all right. And then, like I said, if you don't want to deal with all this stuff in your backyard, we have a community composting cooperative network. So we have 56 sites around the city. You can join one. You take an hour training, which basically just goes over everything we just talked about. And then from there, you can bring, you're supposed to help out 1 hour a month. Everyone's supposed to help out 1 hour a month, so it's not just one person that's doing everything and then burns out and then the whole system fails. So you have yeah, so you have to join, but it's nice. You usually have like work days where you get to meet your neighbors and stuff. It's a great, it's a fun thing to do, rather opposed to doing it all by yourself in your backyard. And we're actually, we launched this pilot program that we're trying to make this app, like a Google Suits app, like a basic app where you can actually track all your stats, like how much you compost every month, and you can have competitions. Who's the lead composter? Which site is the lead composting site? We could do contests and stuff. So we're actually we were in the middle of designing that, and then COVID hit and froze our funds. But we just found some funds to finish the app. So hopefully we'll have that ready by fall. So if you join the Compost Cooperative, you can actually start, tracking your stats and stuff. All right, so that's hot composting. So now I'm going to talk about some alternative ways to compost as well that maybe not as efficient, but they also have, there's some pluses as well. So Bokashi is this is the only anaerobic composting that we do. So some environments, like anaerobic can be good in certain ways. Like that's how they make cheese, beer, kombucha, things like that. It's all anaerobic. So there is good anaerobic bacteria, and Bokashi is one of them. So Bokashi is like this beneficial anaerobic bacteria that you can you can mix it with like rice hulls or spent grains to make this inoculated bran, or you could just buy the bran pre-inoculated. And then the idea is like you compost your food scraps in the sealed container. So you get like a bucket. What's great about this is you don't need carbon material, so you don't need to find like leaves and stuff. You just put some your food scraps in the bottom of this bucket. You sprinkle this bran on top of it, and then you have this like some kind of plastic bag that you push down to keep it kind of sealed and anaerobic, and then you just seal the top. And then what happens is it ferments your food scrap. So it like pickles it basically. So when you open it up, it's got a pickle smell to it. It doesn't smell bad. You keep on doing that. You can just keep this in your house, and you just keep on filling it up. And once it's to the top, you let it just sit there for like a couple weeks, let it kind of break down. And then you could do a couple different things. So it's not completely broken down, but it's pretty close to breaking down. You can actually just bury it in your garden, and then all the biology in your garden will eat it up. You don't have to worry about like, raccoons, digging it up because it's pickled. Most mammals don't like fermented things. Or you can add it to your compost bin as a nitrogen source, and it breaks down really well. Or you could feed it to your worms. Worms love this stuff. So you can have a Verma Compost bin and a Bokashi Compost bin. But it's really amazing stuff. It's just it takes a little, it could be a little pricey. So that's why a lot of people will buy the mixture and make their own brand. Like if you have, we used to get grains from a brewery, dry it out, and then inoculate it with this stuff, and that works really well. Or rice hulls or something like that. So it works pretty well. I'm gonna show you a little video, kind of just to kind of explain a little bit better how this process works.
Have you always wanted to compost but been afraid of brown-green ratios, or nervous about turning the compost pile? Or maybe you're in an urban area. Well, we have a method of composting that's probably perfect for you. The Bokashi Method is a Japanese technique used with anaerobic fermentation. Traditional composting is an aerobic process, meaning it needs oxygen. That's why you need to turn the pile. Fermentation is an anaerobic process, meaning to keep the air away. Therefore, no pile turning. And the secret to this is EM, or effective microorganisms. This mix of lactic acid, yeast, and phototrophic bacteria was perfected by Dr. Tairuo Higa, a professor of horticulture at the University of the Ryukyus in Okinawa. This Bokashi Composting Kit has everything you need to start composting. It contains an airtight bucket with a spout for draining off the Bokashi tea and a bag of the Bokashi starter. You can order single bags of the starter as well. To start, just add a layer of about 3 inches of food scraps to the bucket. Make sure and chop up any large pieces before adding. With Bokashi composting, you can even add meat, cheese, and small bones. Continue layering and adding the starter. Sprinkle the top layer with starter and stir to coat the food. Be generous with the starter if you're composting tough foods like meat, bones, and coffee grounds. Normally, you would use 1/3 of a bag for each full bucket. Place a plate or some other flat object on top to make sure that air doesn't get to the fermenting scraps. Then put the lid on tightly. Make sure it's sealed. Every few days, open the spout and drain off the rich Bokashi tea. Dilute this at a rate of 1 tablespoon to 1 gallon of water and use on your houseplants and in the garden. Repeat this process until your bucket is full, and then set it aside for about 2 weeks to further ferment. I like having 2 buckets going at one time so that I don't have to stop and wait. Don't add water because excessive liquid can make the mix rot. Also, you want to keep your bucket out of the sun. When the bucket is ready, the food won't really look that different, but it will have a sweet and sour pickled aroma and maybe some white growth on the top. These are all good signs. If it smells foul, something went wrong, and you're going to have to either add more starter or throw it out and start all over. This one smells good. After the 2 weeks, dig a 12-inch trench. Drain off the tea. Then bury the Bokashi. If you live in a rural area, you might have to bury it a little bit deeper. Wash the bucket thoroughly, and then you're ready to repeat the process. After 2 weeks, the Bokashi will be broken down even farther, and then you can plant whatever plants you'd like right on top. If you're growing in containers, you can use your Bokashi by filling a container a third of the way with potting soil. Fill it another third with Bokashi. Mix them together thoroughly and top with a final third of potting soil. Cover with plastic to encourage an anaerobic environment. Wait 2 weeks and then plant. You can also add your Bokashi to your regular aerobic compost pile. For more information, check out the book Bokashi Composting and Grow Organic for Life.
All right, that's a really great book. I would recommend. See if we can. Yeah, if you're thinking about trying this Bokashi out, I definitely recommend that book. It's pretty light read and it's pretty thorough. All right, another way is black soldier fly larva. So my first experience with this, if you ever done a bad compost bin, and then all of a sudden there's maggots everywhere. Like when I first saw this, I like freaked out and threw it all away. And then I learned later that these are actually black soldier fly larvae. They're not maggots. And they're actually really fantastic composters. You basically like how you attract them is you have exposed food scraps. So that's so if you're just completely disgusted by this, just don't make sure all your food scraps aren't exposed. Because when exposed, these black soldier flies will lay their larvae. They'll hatch and then they just devour. They'll eat meat, they'll eat bones, they'll eat whatever for like 2 weeks, and then they'll climb somewhere and pupate into a fly. What's also great about this stuff is if you have chickens, this is one of the best things to feed the chickens. It's got like a 1-to-1 ratio of actually being absorbed by chickens or fish or things like that. So you can actually build these bins where if you have like if you have fish or chickens, you put in exposed food scraps. The flies will lay their eggs. The larvae will come out. They'll eat all this stuff up, and then whatever's left over is kind of like this composty. It's a little liquidy, but you can sometimes people will mix in worms and they'll finish it off, or you can just bury it or put it in your compost bin. And then when they're ready to pupate, they'll come up or turn into a fly. They want to climb, so then you put these little PVC pipes. They'll climb up, fall in the bucket, and then you can take that bucket and feed them to your chickens. You can also dry them out or freeze them and things like that if you want to feed them later. I saw this one guy that had this he had his hot tub. He turned to an aquaponics thing where he had fish in the hot tub, and then he had plants. He had all these like garden beds on top of the sides of the hot tubs. And then aquaponics is basically the fish poop in the water, and then that water is with the help of some bacteria turns into fertilizer that fertilizes plants, and then those plants clean the water, and that goes back to the fish. So it's like this closed loop system. But he would go when he went on vacation, he would a week before his vacation, he would start one of these bins and then just have and then track these larvae, and then they would climb up into the PVC pipe and fall into the water and then feed this fish. So it's pretty crazy. Yeah, definitely. This is really if you have chickens, chickens love these things. I would definitely recommend trying out this system. And then trench composting is pretty easy. Like that's basically you dig a trench in a place that you want to garden in a couple, like next season, fill it full of food scraps, bury it, try to bury it 2 to 4 inches so things don't dig it up. And then you come back next season and it's like the most beautiful soil. It's like all that biology and worms and stuff just breaks it all down and just makes it like all, just a giant. Yeah, it's a really awesome way to start a garden. But then there's other ways you could do that with existing gardens. I really like this. This is called the composting pipe or composting tower, where you basically just get like a PVC pipe or something that's got holes on one side and then it's solid in the other. You bury the side with the holes into the ground. Get like a pot or something, just some kind of cap. You could go in like a fishing store. You could buy some like night crawlers or something and throw them in if you want. And then the idea is like after dinner, every day you just throw in your extra food scraps into this pipe. You bury the pipe in the middle of your garden, and then all your worms and stuff will come and they'll grab that food. And worms actually a lot of times they don't want the food scraps, they want the bacteria on the food scraps, so they'll grab a piece of food scraps, so they'll pull it all over your garden in tunnels and then let it all rot and then they'll come back and eat the bacteria. But that's what's great about that is they're just spreading organic matter all over your garden. This is a great way. You saw one in the middle of your garden and then just add food scraps. You don't want to add too much, so pay attention, but then all your biology and worms will just kind of take it out to the garden. So that way it's kind of fertilizing your garden throughout the season. And then there's a cool thing called a keyhole garden, which is a kind of similar concept, but it's like you build this big raised bed, and then right in the middle of the raised bed is you make a hardware cloth kind of a container, and then fill that up with food scraps, and then all your biology and your worms will come and eat those food scraps and then and pull it out. So it's kind of like a super duper compost tower. So you can make some really fancy keyhole gardens. The idea is like it looks like a Pac-Man, so you can actually get in and drop your food scraps in the middle. And then the last thing we're going to talk about real quickly is Verma Compost. So Verma Compost, hands down, the best compost you can make. They've done all kinds of tests, and it's just like it has the best biology, it has the best nutrients. There's something about like the body, the intestines of the worm, where it just creates this perfect environment for plants. So there's some advantages that, it's amazing. You don't have to worry, there's no heat, you don't have to worry about carbon material. But the disadvantages is, they're live animals that you got to take care of. You can't compost everything. Like they hate, like things that smell really bad, like onions and citrus. They don't like, and it just takes longer. But what's cool is they actually keep on reproducing themselves. So you can start out with one bin, and over time they'll keep on doubling their population, and after a while, you'll maybe after a year or two, you might have a lot of worms, and then you're producing more and more quicker and quicker. So how it works is you want to build a worm bin. So this is a standard worm bin. You could build them out of anything, but you get 2 totes, drill holes in one tote. You want to make sure the holes are 1/8 inch or smaller, so the worms can't crawl out of the holes. And then you drill holes on the bottoms of the top bin, so because they produce moisture when they're eating the food scraps, and you want to drain that or it's just going to get smelly. So then the bottom bin is basically the bin that you drain all the liquids from, and then you want to throw that out or throw it in your garden like once a week. You don't want to let it sit for too long, it'll get smelly. And then you make some nesting for the worms, like shredded newspaper. You want to lightly moisten it with like a spray bottle, not too wet. It's good to throw a handful of garden soil. It's for their gizzards, because worms don't have teeth, so they need some kind of gritty soil to swallow, and then they use that as teeth to chew up their food scraps. So you throw in some garden soil just to get their gizzards going, and then you want to order. You don't want to put night crawlers, and so night crawlers are great for your garden, for like keyhole gardens and towers, because they live in the ground. But you want the worms that live on top of the ground, that live in the forest floors, and that's what's called red wigglers. And you can, Uncle Jim's Worm Farm in Pennsylvania, you can order, they'll send you a big bag full of them. Veterans Compost sometimes has, is a local compost organization, sometimes has worms. But you want like at least 1,000 worms. You want a lot of worms to start off. So that could be like $20, $30 of worms, and then you drop them in there. And then you add the food scraps, which we'll talk about in a second. But so there's another, another view of building the bin. So the bottom bin is just to catch, the drainage, and then you want to drill holes on the top bin, on the bottom, and then drill breathing holes, and but none on the top, because you don't want sunlight. They hate sunlight, so they want to. So just on the sides, you have these are for air holes, and then the bottom are for drainage holes, and then no holes on the bottom tote. Add in the newspaper, or you can use shredded paper, whatever, lightly moisten it, add some starter soil, add worms, and then you add some foods that we'll talk about. So I'm gonna play this quick video, kind of show a little bit more about that.
I'm Emily Murphy, and I'm making a worm bin. Now, it might not sound that exciting, but worms are a fabulous way to recycle your kitchen scraps and make soil for your garden. These are red wiggler worms. They're surface feeders, and they make compost quickly by eating through your kitchen scraps. The first thing to remember when making a worm bin is that they're living creatures. And like other living creatures, they need food, water, shelter, and air. So my worm bin has to have circulation and ventilation. I've added these drill holes here using a 1/4-inch drill bit. This is going to be the bottom of my bin. You can see that it's solid. It doesn't have any holes. And then the next level actually has holes in it. Worms can move through here. Water can move through here. Sort of like a cup and a saucer. To make the bedding, I'm going to be using shredded newspaper and leaves. Because believe it or not, worms will end up eating the bedding besides the kitchen scraps. I'm going to start by filling it about 1/3 full. Worms live in a moist environment, so their bin needs to be moist as well. And once that feels like a wrung out sponge, not too wet, not too dry, then I'm going to add a little bit of grit. This is garden soil. The grit helps the worms with their digestion, and I'm also adding fungi and bacteria to the bin at the same time, which also helps with decomposition. Next, of course, the worms. Now, I've ordered these from a local worm farm, but you can probably also find red wigglers, say, at a bait shop. I'm going to add them in, and I can add kitchen scraps now too. So you're going to add your kitchen scraps in, and you can add them in every few days, once a week. And when you do, just put the food in a new place. You put this in, so it's another 1/3 of bedding material. Spray it again so the newspaper is damp. You're going to cover it over, and you're going to store it in a location that's not too cold and not too hot, about 50 to 75 degrees. And there you have it. You can add kitchen scraps and make soil for your garden.
All right. So Lori asked, do you put worms in planters and pots? So never put red wigglers in the garden or in your pots. Like I said, they are surface dwellers. So if you want, you can buy some night crawlers and put them in your garden or your pots. They live in the soil, but usually, I mean, as long as you have healthy soil, they'll come to your soil on their own. So I've never had to actually buy them. I usually just create an environment and they'll come. But I guess you could put them in your containers. I just think that they're going to run out of food and probably leave your container. So I probably wouldn't put them in planters or pots. All right, so feeding your worms. So she talked a little bit about, you want to have like a not thin layer. The secret to worms, you don't want to overfeed them. So you want to kind of give them a little bit of food, and then you want to wait until that food is like 2/3 gone, and then give them a little bit more food, and then definitely take a couple weeks to kind of figure out how much they're eating. And then and you can slowly, as they multiply their population every couple months, you can add more and more, but you want to try to get a standard. If you overfeed them, you're going to start having fruit flies and some smells and stuff. So definitely, be aware of that. And don't feed them, again, citrus or onions or garlic or anything that's pretty strong. You don't want to feed them, because then they'll let you know when they're unhappy, because you'll open up the bin and then they're all on the top trying to climb out. So and then I definitely recommend how she added an extra layer of bedding on top of that. So I definitely recommend that, having like just a next to it, having a bin full of shredded paper. That will help just in case you accidentally do overfeed it. That will prevent flies from it happening, or smells or stuff. It'll just kind of make it. It's just kind of your fail safe. So if you end up overfeeding it, it's not that big of a deal if you add an extra layer of bedding. And then harvesting. So this is tricky. So like, how do you get that? You want all that beautiful um vermicompost, but you don't want it. You want to keep your worms in the bin. So there's a couple different methods that you can do. One is you get another tote, drill out some more holes in it, put it on top of your top bin, take the lid off, and put that lid on the top of the third, on the top. So you'll have like 3 totes basically. And then add an extra layer of bedding and food scraps. And what's going to happen is all those worms are going to climb up into this new tote, because you got holes in the bottom for drainage. So they'll climb up to this new tote, give it an extra couple of weeks, because these are the eggs. You want to wait till the eggs hatch and all the babies will climb up to, and then you could just take that whole tote and just pull it off, and then you're left with the bottom tote is just full of this amazing vermicompost. So another technique as well, if you're not using totes, if you're using like a wood bin, is you just feed, put all your food on one side. All the worms will migrate, given over a week or two, given an extra week for the eggs to hatch and migrate, and then you just scoop out that vermicompost and then put the food scraps on the other side, and just kind of go back and forth from that way. And then where you store it, like under the kitchen sink, something in the shade, ideally like you want them indoors, but if you have to store them outdoors, especially in the winter, it's going to be really harsh on them. But if you have to store them outdoors, try to bury them in the hole, at least, don't completely bury them. You want oxygen to still get in, but just kind of dig a hole and put the bin in it, so at least that like that you're getting that ground ambient temperature, and you can even put like mulch and stuff on the top to kind of keep it warm. So a lot of times people will keep them out in the winter if they can't bring them indoors, and most of the population will die off, but then they'll some will survive, and then they'll repopulate again. But ideally, keep them indoors if possible. And then, vermicompost. So troubleshooting. So if you do get flies, because you overfed them, that's why it's nice to have, add extra bedding to keep them, from fruit flies and stuff from getting in there. Definitely, I made a group house pretty mad because I attracted fruit flies, and but I learned that these little techniques where you get a jar full of apple cider vinegar, put the paper in a cone, that took care of the fruit flies in a day. All of them fly in, and they can't figure out how to fly out, and you put a couple of them around, and definitely, it took care of them. But you don't want, ideally you don't want to do, you don't want to attract fruit flies. So that's why having, having extra bedding and then covering your food scraps. Well, really like dialing in how much, trying to figure out how much food they eat a week, and then not overfeeding them is the best thing to do. Because if that food scrap sits there for longer than a week, you may have some fruit flies. But also, having extra bedding on top of it, like a lasagna method, will help as well. If you ever open it up and all your worms are trying to get out, that could be because it's too wet in there. So maybe you got to drill some more holes, or maybe you need to empty the drainage tray as much as possible. Maybe you put a bunch of onions or something in it, and they're not happy. So definitely check, the holes in the bedding, and maybe add some more bedding in as well. So they should not be. I mean, this is a sign when they're trying to get out, is a sign that you're doing something wrong. So it could be too wet, it could be too dry, not enough air, extreme temperatures. Like if you let it sit in the sun, it could get too hot, and they'll want to get out. So definitely, if you have that happen, definitely do some troubleshooting. There are some alternative worm beds. There's these hotels where you start out, you put the food and bedding in one bed, and they start eating, but then like a couple weeks later you put some bedding and food in the next one, they'll migrate up because there's holes between each shelf, and then you could pull the bottom shelf out and harvest that, and you just keep on having them work their way upward. There are people that have done like worm beds in the ground where they dig a hole and stuff. There's usually a lot of issues with that, especially over the winter, but there's some good YouTubes videos if you want to try that. And then compost tea. So it is 8:30, but I'm going to wrap up real soon. just to make sure everything's on recorded. But compost tea, yeah, we should be on in there like 5 or 10 minutes, but if you got to go, no worries. So we already talked a lot about compost tea in the critter class, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but mainly it's basically you get some finished compost, put in like a pantyhose, you let it sit in the water, you get a like a $10 aquarium pump that bubbles it, add some organic molasses to feed it, and then let it bubble for like a couple days, and then that water is just like full of this amazing biology that you can spray to deal with fungicides and pesticides. It's like a fungicide, but it's also it's super healthy to, biology that can inoculate your soil. But we talked a lot about it already, so I'm just gonna kind of move on this, and then this is the last section. So we'll just spend a couple minutes talking about compost safety. Again, I would avoid using dairies, meats, animal manures, and stuff like that, unless unless you got a really hot system that you know what you're doing, because it's just you can have some pathogens that can, or some smells or things if you're using meats and dairies. Ensure you have proper drainage. If you don't have good drainage and it's getting over wet, that's a great way to start building up pathogens and things like that. So you need to have decent drainage for your compost, or it's going to get super smelly. Monitoring the temperatures is a great way, not only to see that you're doing it right, but also to see if like I said, if you can get that up to 135 degrees for a couple of days, that's going to help kill any kind of pathogens or anything in there. Hygiene, definitely. Whenever you're working with compost, make sure to wash your hands and don't eat, right afterwards, because especially not finished compost, there could be all kinds of things. Once it's finished, it's pretty good, but until it's finished, it could be all kinds of things in there, and you just want to make sure to wash your hands, and especially if you have kids around, have them wash their hands. Especially like steaming compost as well. You don't want to breathe that in. So if it's steaming, try to get on the other side. Or if it's too dry, sometimes there'll be some fungal stuff on top. You want to wet that down because you can inhale that. It's not really a big issue unless you already have lung issues. And if you already have lung problems, you definitely want to not inhale this stuff, because it can cause a lot of irritation on your lungs as well. So try, if you have steaming piles, wet it down, or make sure you're on the side that's not where you're not breathing it, or wear a mask. And then when you're adding compost, like top dressing, don't add it a month before you're supposed to harvest. You probably can if you feel good about your compost, but if there's if it's a bad batch, or even if it's a bad batch, let's say like you did something wrong and there's some pathogens, like maybe it was too the drainage was bad, or someone threw a chicken bone in there. You can still just it will all break down. Like you can still add it to your garden, or you can let it sit in a pile for a couple months, and then all the bad pathogens will get broken down. Or you can add it to the garden, and it'll still be fine. It's just if you're top dressing some lettuce and you have a bad batch, you don't want to top dress it, and then a week later harvest that lettuce, because it could have some bad stuff to it. So it's nice to yeah, if you're harvesting stuff like lettuce, don't top dress it like a month before, And then if you feel and get any kind of irritation or rashes or something from the compost bin, definitely get it checked out. And that's it for the class, for our compost class tonight. Thank you all so much for hanging out. If you did not join in the beginning, so we talked about maybe stick around for a little bit, because we're actually, this is going to be the last class, and then we're going to change to hands-on classes, or at the farm. So we're changing stuff. So if you didn't join us in the beginning, stick around and I can talk a little bit about that. But if not, if anyone has any questions about the class, we can answer that really quickly. Or if not, I can explain a little bit more about the next class. But I'll give a couple minutes just to see if anyone has any specific questions. And if not, I'll explain what we're going to be doing with our class moving forward.
Another good class, Josh.
Thanks, Ronnie. All right, well, if there's no question, or go ahead.
I'm gonna head off. I heard in the beginning about the hands-on for the next 4 weeks. I like that idea.
Cool. Yeah, and we'll send an email as well. But Um, yeah, just in case anyone didn't hear it, I'll just explain it really quickly. But if you already heard it, feel free to sign off. But the next 4 classes are basically going to be identical to our recordings last year. So I'm just going to send those classes to you all. You can watch it on your own time. It's about fruit trees, 2 food justice classes, and the harvesting class. And then instead, since it's like the sun, it's sunny out, till 8 o'clock, we're going to start doing Wednesday evenings at farms for the next 4 classes. So we'll start from 6 to 8 p.m. So you can join us if you want. If you just want to watch the recordings, that's fine. And then do your own thing for the certification. Volunteer somewhere else, and that's fine. Or if you want to join us, we'll try to do some hands-on lessons as well on the farm. And then we're also going to be training people to host weekend hours as well on the farm. So if any of those are interested to you, we can check it out. But I'll send an email with those 3 options. But just letting you know, we're not going to do any more live webinar classes. Cool. Okay, so Lori asks, organic garden soil bags says to wear gloves. If organic, why wear gloves? Yeah, no, if it's organic and it's fine, you don't need gloves. I mean, sometimes maybe if it's in the bag and maybe it's been anaerobic, it might be a little stinky for a while. But there's actually like antidepressants in the soil, so I don't wear gloves that often. But yeah, if it's good soil, you're fine. But I mean, if it's bad, yeah, if it's smelly, I probably would wear gloves. But if it's not smelly, you should be good. Oh yeah, we're gonna be at the new 16th Street Farm tomorrow between 10 to 1. We're gonna do a lot of we're gonna be sculpting our beds, doing broad forking and tilling and things like that. So it'll be a really good time if you can join us. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, I'm going to end it. And hopefully I'll see you tomorrow. If not, I'll send you an email with all the updates to the class. And y'all take care.